So good morning and good afternoon to those who are joining us from the East Coast. I want to share a short recent story as a way of linking to what we're talking about today before we really give the microphone in the morning to Rabbi Dr. Berenbaum, who is our speaker this morning. As many of you know, I just came back from our inaugural shul, meditation, yoga, nigun, and Hasidic study retreat. We embedded within a place in Guatemala called the Yoga Forest, which has its own schedule, and then we added onto it. And so we were not the only people there. So once there were some people who were just kind of there on their own, and they heard that after one of the meals, we were going into one of the yoga shalas and doing nigun, doing chanting and singing. They asked if they could participate. We said, sure, this is ecumenical. There'll be no words, there'll be just tune. So a bunch of them joined, young people who had met each other while they were already at the retreat center, but they didn't think they were doing anything other than coming to Guatemala to do yoga meditation. I was sitting next to, in the singing circle, a woman that I had met earlier, a young Dutch woman from the town of Utrecht. She just finished her university studies. She's now doing what many Europeans do and Israelis do, basically traveling the world before settling down and getting a job. She grew up in Holland, and she decided to join this experience and started in the singing circle. I noticed that during the singing that something was coming over her. It was more than just song. She was getting emotional. Her face was flushed. There was something big happening for her. And afterwards, we were just kind of all enjoying a cup of tea together. I said, I want to pry, but I just noticed that was big for you. Can you tell me what's going on? She said it brought her full circle and brought back a story that she remembered her grandmother would tell her. So she's my kid's generation, essentially. When her grandmother was 8 or 9 years old, living in Amsterdam, her parents, so this woman's great-grandparents, hid and saved a Jewish family in their basement. She didn't know the story well because it's already 3 generations ago. Like, how many of us know details of the stories of what our great-grandparents did? But she always knew that her family was almost singularly responsible for saving one single Jewish family. And here she comes on a trek to Central America. She shows up to do yoga meditation, and by coincidence or not coincidence, she's sitting in a room with a rabbi and Jews singing Jewish songs. And she felt as if the universe was coming back into alignment. The reason why I tell that story is that there are always more stories to tell about the Shoah, about life, of course, but one has never fully explored all the sub-stories and the sub-stories of what happened to our people, the tragedy, and the inspiring stories as well. And even if you've been studying this material for decades, which on some level I have, the doors that one has not yet opened can be yet more illuminating the ones that you already went through. When we were planning our itinerary, our trip was going to originally, and some of you already know this, end in Skopje, North Macedonia. And at one point, I think the conversation was something like this. I was talking to Dr. Berenbaum saying, you know, we're going to be hanging out in Skopje, North Macedonia, and I think there's a Holocaust Museum there. He says, yes, I know, I designed it. And so he put us in touch with Goran Sadikario, who is a Macedonian Jew, who gave us a phenomenal tour of this incredible museum, both to the Balkan Jewish history and to the Macedonian Jewish experience in the Shoah. And we kept going back and forth, as you'll hear from Dr. Berenbaum, between a certain elation at being reminded of the story of the saving of Bulgaria's Jews, and then the incredibly heavy-heartedness thinking about the utter annihilation of the Macedonian Jews, whose stories I knew nothing about before this experience. And it seems like it's in the zeitgeist right now because our WhatsApp group keeps finding article after article after article, people pushing Bulgaria to recognize sort of the mixed story of their saving of Jews. And the story of the Macedonian Jews is becoming more and more known. So we decided that would be a good opportunity both for a mini reunion for the Balkans trip and also because we have really, without any hyperbole, one of the world's foremost experts on this very topic in our community. We're so grateful to Dr. Berenbaum for giving us his time and his insight and his wisdom. So welcome, Rabbi Dr. Berenbaum. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Let me just ask a mundane question. How many of you went on the trip? Okay, I'm going to then play about a 5-minute clip to begin with, and then we'll begin a conversation, which is our promo on the museum, and it'll give you a sense of what it's like, and then we'll talk beyond that.
This museum is not just a museum, this is an educational center, because in this museum we're presenting 2 millennia presence of the Jews in Macedonia, but also we educate on the horrific events that took place during the Second World War and the destruction of the Jewish community during that period of time.
The whole idea in the beginning, and this is a theme that carries through, is this rebuilding of identity, the attempt to sensitize the visitor to understand that these were the victims, but before these people were victims, they were human beings. They were just like you and I.
The roots of Macedonian Jewry are ancient. The oldest synagogue outside the land of Israel is found in Stobi. It meant that the Jewish community has been there since before the Common Era. The history of Macedonian Jewry also encompasses the incredible period of time of the Jewish Renaissance in Spain, and it also deals with the incredible period of Ladino culture. We will then deal with the unique period of the Holocaust. The tobacco factory in Monopole was, in essence, a ghetto that existed for some 3 weeks.
The challenge of creating the exhibit for Monopole was profound. We created this sculpture of this tornado of suitcases from above. And as you look up and you see these things, we begin to understand what the people themselves were thinking. And that's why this space becomes so incredibly powerful. And of the most dramatic elements is the train car that is completely similar to the type of train cars that took the Jews from Monopole to Treblinka. We created a model so that people could understand how in such a tiny space, almost 1 million people can be murdered and destroyed. One of the culminations of the Treblinka experience happens actually just outside of the gallery when people look up and they see the jaws of a giant shovel from a bulldozer. And then there's a picture that shows how this item was used in the Treblinka death camp. We got 6 local artists and created a story of the partisan uprising in Macedonia and put together this mural, which is quite astounding on many levels. And once again, we come back to our theme of picture frames, but they're all empty. And the pictures that we've seen in the commemoration area, they're now all blurred because those people don't exist anymore.
This museum wants to remind that our multi-religious and multicultural and multi-ethnic society needs to build bridges instead of walls between the community.
When I came into this museum, I thought I was only going to learn about the Holocaust, but I actually learned a lot about the Jewish community as a whole. It was a really enlightening experience, and I was deeply touched by all the things that they've gone through, all the discrimination that has been placed upon them.
This museum will be a fitting tribute to those who were murdered. It will be an appropriate remembrance for the Jewish life that thrived in Macedonia but is no longer. And it is a remembrance of the past that seeks to transform the future, to teach responsibility and respect, and to enhance human dignity and human decency. Okay, I'm going to talk for about 15, 20 minutes and then take questions, comments, responses, reactions, because in one sense I'm interested in learning from you since you guys visited the museum and we learn from every visitor. And part of what I love to do is to be a fly on the wall during exhibitions. Let me also advertise one thing, which is we've had a trip to the Auschwitz exhibition at the Reagan Library, Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, for the empty nesters. We're going to have one for the rest of the congregation. We urge you to see it. Those of you who have seen it have found it to be an important piece of work, and it's thriving in terms of attendance at the Reagan Library. So if you want to see a little bit more about what I do, then we'll do that. Let me start by saying that Museum Creation 101 is to ask actually 4 or 5 questions, but since we're Jews, I put it as 4 questions, which has a hidden 5th. Simple questions: what, where, with what, how? What do you want to say? And what do you want to say also includes the question, not only what do you want to say, but for whom are you saying it? Where are you saying it? Where is a matter of place, but also a matter of time. To understand that where transforms what you experience, think of the following verse from Psalms. Al naharot Bavel sham yashavnu v'gam bachinu b'zachrenu et Zion, and think of the song by the waters of Babylon. We sat and we wept as we remembered Jerusalem. The place from which you remember an event shapes how you remember it. Therefore, the story of the Holocaust is told differently in Budapest than it is in Bucharest. It's told differently in Washington than it is Jerusalem, told differently in Warsaw than it is in Berlin, told differently in Paris than it is in Skopje, because the place from which you remember an event shapes how you remember it. The third question becomes with what? And with what means what material do you have to create an exhibition? And by the way, the question of where also means where are we in that moment in time? Let me give you a couple of examples. Where in the moment of time, we are at the transitional moment between lived history and historical memory. Many of the museums were first created when the survivors were younger and more vibrant. And we're now in the waning hours of the life of survivors, and it's safe to say that in another 10 years, you will barely have a survivor on the earth, and another 20 years you will not. We're 77 years since the event, and in one sense, you will not have living memory in another 10, 20 years because of the nature of what living memory is. In fact, I probably know 2 stories. I know the youngest survivor of Auschwitz. And I know, and I'll tell you a cute story. The youngest survivor of Auschwitz was born on December 29th, 1944. Now, those of you who know the history of Auschwitz know something very interesting, that the Germans left Auschwitz on January 16th, 1945. Mathematics means that you have 16 and 2, you have 18 days in which this young infant had to live under Nazi domination. The infant was born too weak to cry. Being born too weak to cry, that was the secret of his survival, because had he cried, he would have died, but you could put him on a top bunk and nobody could see him. And consequently, he was able to survive for those 16 days. So he's clearly the youngest survivor of Auschwitz. We just lost a 10-year-old survivor of Auschwitz, a man by the name of Tom Bergenthal. And Tom Bergenthal was the story worth telling. He was the only American justice at the International Court of Human Rights. 10-year-old survivor of Auschwitz, and what happened to him, which was very interesting, he was asked to be a judge on the Forreston case of Holocaust denial, and he wrote a note to his fellow justices: I guess since I lived through the Holocaust, and I was in Auschwitz, and I saw all of this, I must recuse myself because I could be a witness in the trial, and did it in such a way that he laid out documentary proof for the Holocaust, which is his way of warning his colleagues, this is not bullshit, this is very important. Place becomes place in time, with what becomes the nature of artifacts. And you have a series of tools. You have artistic tools. You saw the mural, for example, to the partisans, because the partisans have guns, they have bullets, they have memories, they have medals, but the question is, how do you portray it? You also have the question of what other artifacts do you have? Interestingly enough, in Macedonia, we have the pictures of all of the victims because the Macedonians were photographed. They photographed the entire population, and we have their identity cards, therefore we have pictures. We also have a very interesting thing, which, and you don't think of it, but this is an incredible artifact. What do your keys represent? Your keys represent that when you left home today, you expect to be able to go back to your home and what? Use a key to enter your home. You expect your home to be safe. The key represents also when you parked your car in the lot, you presume when you walk out what? Your car is going to be there. Keys represent essentially safety and protection. Now, interestingly enough, the Macedonians, when the Jews were being deported from their homes, the Macedonians insisted that they put their keys in an envelope and mark the address on the envelope, because it's, in the words of the prophet, Haratzachta v'gam yarashta, do you want to both murder and what? And inherit. And therefore they wanted to both murder, they didn't do the actual murdering, they merely deported them, but they wanted to profit from it by the keys. So we have the keys. We also have the testimony of somebody who said, you know, I didn't put my right address. And I hope to this day they're searching for the, I won't use the words in the synagogue, but you can imagine the epithets that he continued. I hope they're still searching for which key fits in which door and which lock. And you saw the nature of a small act of resistance. How then becomes the idea of putting it together? And putting it together becomes the thing. So let's talk a little bit about the unique responsibilities we had in Macedonia. And by the way, when we worked on it, it was Macedonia. They came to an agreement with Greece, because Greece claims that Macedonia is Greek. Philip, all of you, the most you knew about Macedonia before you went there was Philip of Macedon, who was the father of what? Alexander the Great. And that probably limits your knowledge of Macedonian history. And I don't mean that to insult you, I mean that to describe you and the like. The question of what do we want to do? We presumed for a moment that the major story people are going to come to see is the Holocaust story. But we have a moral commitment that before they were victims, they were people. And also, we also have a hidden commitment, and the easiest way to scratch your left ear is not with your right hand behind your things. So in the yeshiva, we were taught this way, and this way. If you were beating around the bush, you went this way. We felt that this was the only time that most of the audience would ever be exposed to Jews or Judaism. Jewish population in Macedonia is a couple hundred, and consequently, they're not going to do this. We also felt that we wanted to tell the story of the unique history of how the Jews got there. So let me take you through the museum very briefly. You have and then tell the story of the Holocaust. You have an orientation film, and then you walk up a staircase, and we had a pre-existing building. When I want to create museums, I always say, please give us 6 months ahead of the architects, because if form follows function, we want to know what the hell you put in the building before we get an architectural device. We had three-story building. We shaped a memorial that goes down with 7,144 different strands, almost like tzitzit, between strings and knots, to represent the 7,144 Jews who were killed from Macedonia. But as you walk up the stairs, we have a kaleidoscope of Jewish history. So as you're walking up, you see all of the events of Jewish history, from the Exodus all the way through, from the Exodus to the conquest of the land of Israel, to the Ten Commandments, the Exodus, the Ten Commandments, conquest of the land of Israel, kingdom of David and Solomon, the destruction of the first kingdom. You then go through the building of the Second Temple, all the way through, including the Spanish Inquisition, culminating in the Shoah itself and in the foundation of the State of Israel. So if you were merely to go up there, you could do this, and the assumption behind it is there are three levels of museum visitors: skimmers, swimmers, deep divers. You have to appeal to all three levels. If you're a skimmer, you got to figure that what our presentation of Jewish history is the equivalent of a series of billboards. In communication, billboards communicate in 7 seconds at 60 miles an hour. But if you think of how much information you get from billboards over those 7 seconds, while they're looking elsewhere and talking about something else, you understand that skimmers can get something, can absorb something, can understand something, and it will shape in a certain respect your behavior by what you experience. So this is for the skimmers. We then make a claim, which happens to have a wonderful justification about the history. The claim is that the Jews have been in Macedonia since before Jesus. And the oldest known synagogue is in Macedonia, and is, again, a synagogue that was created in the 2nd century before the Common Era. By the way, Saul of Tarsus, before he was St. Paul, preached in this area. And therefore, we established the ancient roots of the Jewish community in this land. And once we're at it, we use it as another way to describe what a synagogue is, because people are not going to know what a synagogue is. We then take them through the great, and most Macedonian Jews trace their origin not to the ancient community, but to the Spanish exile of 1492. But before we see the exile, we see the world of Spanish Jewry. We also then have the most famous Jewish artifact in the entire Balkans is the Sarajevo Haggadah. Sarajevo Haggadah was done in 1350. It went into exile from Spain, and it then went not only to Spain, it went from Spain to Italy. From Italy, ultimately, it arrived in Sarajevo. It was hidden during World War I. It was hidden during World War II. It was hidden also during the siege of Sarajevo in the Balkan Wars. It was hidden during World War during World War II by a Muslim who put it under the crib of his child, under the mattress of the crib of his child, and kept this precious thing. I have a facsimile of it. And once we were telling the story of Sarajevo, the story of the Sarajevo Haggadah, we naturally did what? Told the story of Passover with all of its elements, and showed not only and remember that the Passover Haggadah is the most published Jewish book in the world. And think of it in your homes, you probably own 25 Haggadot of different sorts, and it tells an entire history. I once lost a friendship with the great Yosef Yerushalmi, who wrote a wonderful book called The Haggadah in History. And I wrote him a note congratulating him on it. It was all the magnificent manuscripts of the seminary library of all the Haggadot. And I said, you left out one very important thing. You left out the the Maxwell House Haggadah. And the Maxwell House Haggadah was, again, a throwaway by a corporation to give the Jews what they wanted and indicate a certain affinity to the Jews. And for many people, it was the one Haggadah that they used. If you think back of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and if you think of our Haggadot and the creativity involved in those Haggadot, it's an incredible tribute to the vitality of Judaism and of the Jewish people, the way in which the Haggadah, what is presented, evolved, and everybody now has a Haggadah. You have it for vegans and for this and for that and for everybody, every form, every movement has it, every non-movement. For women's Haggadah, you have it all over the place, part of the creativity, but the Sarajevo Haggadah gave us the opportunity to what? To tell the story of Passover. We tell the story of Spanish exile, and then we tell another story which is very important and very significant, which is the fact is that the Ottoman Empire sent ships to Spain to bring Jews from Spain to the Ottoman Empire. They brought with them the printing press, they brought with them steel, they brought with them communication, and they brought with them globalization. The discards of one society were the contributors to another society in an incredible way. By the way, this was partially on a very, very mini scale duplicated by the fact that Turkey recruited German professors who were being thrown out of German universities, and you had the best German university outside of Germany, outside of Jerusalem, in Turkey. They revamped music, they revamped law, they revamped medicine, they revamped architecture, and they brought it up to the 20th century standards. So the discards of one society become what? Become the recruits of another society, and we tried to show that Jews were contributors to the advancement of the society. It had the great virtue of the fact that not only was it useful, but it also was true. We then move from there to a very minor chapter, which most Jewish history discards, but we have the most famous Jew buried within eyesight of the museum was Nathan of Gaza, who was John the Baptist to Shabtai Tzvi. Shabtai Tzvi was, in Gershon Sholom's word, the mystical Messiah, the failed Messiah who responded to the events of 1648 and 1650. Protach V'tat. Protach V'tat were the Khmelnytsky massacres. And by the way, if you go to Kiev, there's a statue to Khmelnytsky in Kiev because Khmelnytsky is a great Ukrainian nationalist. He also was the greatest slaughterer of Jews until he was surpassed by a good friend, Adolf Hitler. So in response to that, you had a messianic movement of Shabtai Tzvi, which had captured a good deal of the Jewish community, most especially in the Balkans where it was rooted, and was the scandal of Jewish history. Because Nathan of Gaza is buried, and by the way, his grave was only overturned in 1963 by the great earthquake, but he's buried literally within about 600 yards, maybe 500 yards of the museum itself. So we tell a brief story of the Sabbatean community and of the Sabbatean resistance. Many of you could have missed it, but it's there. And it tells you, then we move into the question of what was this community? And we show the town of Skopje, merely because we are in Skopje. If we were really to tell the history of Macedonian community, you would tell the story of Bitola, which is a much more influential and significant community, which we do. But we focus on because we juxtapose two windows to a picture on the windows of the ancient city, of the ancient Jewish community of Skopje, which we present, and then you see the current reality of Skopje. We talk about Ladino culture. Ladino has ironically and tragically been almost destroyed by the Shoah because it was Judeo-Spanish, done by the survivors of the Spanish Inquisition, and had its own um, dynamic to it. Roughly, this is the equivalent of the way in which Yiddish was used by Ashkenazi Jewry. But the difference here between Ladino and Yiddish is at least the segments of the ultra-Orthodox community are preserving Yiddish by speaking Yiddish. We do not have the same type of living Ladino community. It is becoming a historic language, and the remnant of it we have, by the way, is that if you look in our Sidur, you have the Ladino version of Ein Kelohenu, printed, and maybe, we know that Ikar, they sing it. Maybe we should begin to sing it as well as a remnant of this community. But we try to do something. In Hebrew, they say Zecher Davar, to remember it. We then have the transition to, and by the way, we see secularization. Secularization was represented by the Alliance schools, the French impact on the culture, and the beginning of secularization, the beginning, by the way, of the integration of women into society. We show you the courtyard, we show you the Jewish life before secularization and the transformation involved in secularization. We then switch and go into the Holocaust area, but the only way to understand the Holocaust area is to present a minor motif and a major motif. The minor motif in Skopje is what the Nazis did outside of Skopje, outside of Macedonia. And therefore we present a film on the rise of Nazism, which ironically has now become much more important in our world, because we're all asking, how does democracy fail? Polarization, and also what that means about the fragility of democracy, the introduction of violence into the political life, and also the way in which that appeals and leads to authoritarian, ultimately totalitarian government. And we show the rise of Nazism, and that presents the context for what happens in Macedonia. In Macedonia, the history of the Shoah can be told in the following way. Bulgaria occupied Macedonia, Thrace, and the like. Bulgaria gave citizenship to the non-Jews living in Macedonia, but did not give citizenship to the Jews. We could now stress that citizenship counts, because we're going to see how that impacted in a very real way. They had an extra tax on the Jews, a tax, by the way, that was customary in Muslim lands. Jews in the Muslim world were a tolerated minority, the people of the book, but that didn't mean that they did not face discrimination, but they certainly did not face annihilation and did not face the same type of persecution they faced elsewhere. But they did face discrimination, and in Macedonia, the Bulgarians attacked the Jewish community economically. And then, lo and behold, what then happens is the entire process that occurred in Hungary, in Poland, in German-occupied Poland, occurs in Bulgarian-occupied Macedonia, but it occurs over a 3-week period. Deportation, ghettoization, deportation, death, murder. The Jews are taken from their homes in Bitola, in Skopje, and in a couple of smaller towns. They are moved into a factory called Monopol, which is a tobacco factory, which becomes a ghetto for 3 weeks. And then they are deported on trains which the Macedonians provide. They are deported on trains to Treblinka, and in Treblinka they are murdered. The statistics of Treblinka are the following. Approximately 925,000 Jews were murdered between the 23rd of July and the 4th of August. 23rd of July, 1942, and the 4th of August, 1943. If you were in Warsaw, I would say essentially between Treblinka opened on July 22nd. The first deportation from Warsaw was July 23rd, which was Tisha B'Av. And between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, at least 265,000 Jews were sent from Warsaw to Treblinka. And of those, 99.9999% of the Jews who arrived were killed. And as you think next month and a half, when we go from Tisha B'Av to Yom Kippur, think of that, losing 250,000 Jews, murdering 250,000 Jews, and annihilating a virtual community. In Macedonia, they sent them all to Treblinka, and none returned from Treblinka. None. That ironically has an echo in the post-war world, because if Treblinka had less than 100 survivors, 67 survivors, known survivors, we did not know what Treblinka was for a very long time. And because we didn't know what Treblinka was for a very long time, every time somebody knocked at the door of your home, you didn't know if it was somebody returning. You didn't know who was coming back. So we take you into Monopole, we take you into the deportation, we take you then into Monopole, and we have a very great advantage at that point physically, because we descend the staircase. And when we descend a staircase, you're walking down into the abyss. If you create a museum on multiple floors, you have to think of it as a play in multiple acts. And you have to complete one act before you descend and go to the second act, or before you ascend and go. That's how you create a museum with the physicality that is necessary. And remember, a museum is different than a film. A film has a captive audience and moving imagery, and a museum has a moving audience and captive imagery. Both are storytelling institutions. We then descend. We see Monopole, and you have a wall that goes up about 35 or 40 feet. You have all of the suitcases that people brought. You have the train, and the train then brings you into Treblinka. Train brings you into Treblinka, and we have a depiction of Treblinka. We have a model of Treblinka. We have a recreation of the Soviet tank of Treblinka, because in Treblinka they used a tank engine as the instrumentality of murder. And as a sub-theme, we show you the 5 other death camps with testimony from the other death camps. We walk out and we see what is unique about resistance in Macedonia, which is the fact that Jews fought as an integrated part of the partisan units. In other places, Jews had to fight alone. Only in France and in Yugoslavia were Jews an integrated part of the partisan units, and Jews were particularly heroic, almost because they had to be. They were fighting for their existence, for their lives. One of the great heroes of the nation is a Jewish woman who was an enormously proud partisan. We tell her story. We hear from one of the generals. Jews rose to the highest levels of partisan elements. We tell the story of several of the Jews who were involved in that. And then we look at what was scant, but very important. We look at rescue. And rescue had a very interesting thing. Rescue had Albania was a point of rescue, and Albania was a wonderful point of rescue. Albania had a notion of something called Besa. Bessa was the way in which the commitment that the Muslims made if they invited you into their home to protect you once they invited you into their home. And we have a wonderful testimony of a man actually who lives in Southern California who says, my father came, he pretended to be a Muslim and he pretended to be a doctor. Everybody knew that he was not a Muslim, but a Jew, and everybody knew he was not a doctor, but he knew more about medicine than anybody else. And he functioned completely for the 2.5 years we were in Albania as what? As a doctor and as a Muslim. And this is the story. So everybody was pretending that that something else was happening. And we show the number of elements of rescue. We then also show something else which is very unique about this area. Bulgaria had signed a document with Eichmann's assistant called the Belev-Daniker document, in which they had agreed to deport 20,000 Jews. They only had 11,344 Jews between Thrace and Macedonia. They agreed 20,000 Jews to Treblinka. Where do you get the rest of them? You get the rest of them in Bulgaria. That's the moment that Bulgaria, which had been persecuting its Jews, which had laws against Jews, had discrimination against Jews, had violence against Jews, that's the moment that civil society arose. Lawyers protested, literary figures protested, parliamentary figures protested, and all of a sudden you have the question of the combination. What is it that resists a totalitarian effort? Civil society, but civil society that protects its own citizens. And remember who was denied citizenship? The Jews. Consequently, if you want to underscore what citizenship counts, rights are determined by citizenship and the protection afforded to you, to your own government. So Bulgaria did not carry out its contract with Germany because of the result of civil society in Bulgaria. And this plays a very particular role because Bulgaria wants to presume that it is greater than Denmark. After all, 50,000 Bulgarian Jews were saved. But they were only saved after what? After the hands of the Bulgarian officials, government, including the king, were what? Filled with blood. And by the way, you also have a very interesting thing, which is Archbishop Roncalli, who later became John the 23rd, who Pope John the 23rd, who is now Saint John the 23rd. And we don't have a right to speak about Catholic saints, but for Jews, St. John is St. John the 23rd. He wrote to the Bulgarian king and essentially said that if you deport the Jews of Bulgaria, the Lord, your place in the next world will be no possibility of salvation in the next world. He essentially did this when he was the apostolic delegate, not the papal nuncio. He was the apostolic delegate in Turkey, but he had previously served in Bulgaria, and he had a tremendous love for the Balkans and the Ottomans, so much so that he did something that is impossible to believe. He took a Turkish cook with him to Paris. Now, he may be a saint, but if you have tasted the difference between Parisian food and Turkish food, I ask you why anybody would take a Turkish cook to Paris unless your palate is very different than mine. I've also been wanting a business school student to tell me why anybody would eat in McDonald's in Paris when it's more expensive than eating in some of the local cafes. And I don't know about you, but I've never had a bad meal in Paris. The worst meal I've had in Paris was on Air France when you get kosher food on, on, on the airlines, and even that is much better than anything else you get, etc. So we tell the story about Bulgaria and about the revolt of civil society. We had to fight with our client who kept wanting to say the fascist, murderous Bulgarians as an adjective to everything. And we kept saying sometimes understatement is better than overstatement and the like. We then had a second issue, which is the question of how do you come back after this destruction? So we first show you emptiness, the void. The picture frames that are what? Picture frames that we show at the beginning are now empty, with the idea that you come back, there's nobody left. 7,144 people were killed, 98% of the community. We show that most of the remaining Jews left for what? For Israel. And you had a period of time in which Yugoslavia was one of the very few countries that permitted the Jews to immigrate, and ironically did different than Romania. One of the very interesting things about the post-Holocaust area is that Romania, which during the Holocaust at one point discovered that living Jews may be more valuable than dead Jews if you can sell living Jews. So remember the ads, 10,000, a million Jews for 10,000 trucks. After the war, Ceausescu was bribed in excess of $1 billion by the Jewish communities of the world to rescue Romanian Jews from Romania to Israel. And the largest Jewish community until the Great Soviet Migration were people who were natives of Romania. And Romania, ironically, because he was bribed and he kept the money and he didn't double cross the Jews, the Romanian Jewish community still maintained its infrastructure, old age homes, schools, synagogues, for Jews who did not immigrate, for Jews who did not go on Aliyah. Bulgarian Jewry, as part of the migration of Yugoslavian Jewry to Israel, becomes again a community which maintains some customs in Bulgaria. And then we had to present, as it were, the living Jewish community of Bulgaria, of Macedonia, which is what? A remnant of a remnant of a remnant, but has a synagogue. It's all migrated, not from Bitola to Skopje, and they have decided to make this museum as a contribution to the Macedonian people and as a remembrance of their past, but also contribution to their fellows. That's the nature of the museum. That's the nature also a little bit of the society and a little bit of what we do. And then we conclude with a concluding film, which asks, what are the implications of the Holocaust in this place and at this time? And what's the transition that we have to take? And that's part of the effort of this museum and part of what went into it. We began working on this in 2009, and we opened a temporary exhibition in 2011, and we opened the permanent exhibition in 2018. And the museum had what happened to all museums during COVID, which is that it was on the verge of demise. But you have one interesting thing in Macedonia economically, which is that the Jewish community received the property of the community that was destroyed. And if you go to Bitola, the downtown of Bitola was the downtown of many cities, places, and the like. It was a Jewish downtown. So the properties were and are valuable. And consequently, this Jewish community, the one Jewish community that I know of, whose income exceeds its needs because of the fact that 200 Jews are now coming and taking the property and possessions of 7,144 Jews who were murdered. And one of their deals with the government was to build the museum as part of its contribution. The museum's location is phenomenal. It's right next to the same block as the Supreme Court, as the Museum to Macedonian Jewry, and you could not ask if in real estate, location, location, location. This is an incredible location. They have a building next door, which they erected on this property. That building next door is part of the a World Bank, and consequently, they have the income to sustain this, even though they have a limited community. And the education ministry is bringing students in. And if Skopje develops as a place of tourism, then the museum will get visited by the outside, but in the interim, it's meant for visitation on the inside. I spoke longer than I wanted, but I wanted to give you a complete background. Let's talk. I always talk longer than I want. Let's. Barbara.
First of all, as I've told you personally, but I'll say it in front of other people, I think this is the finest Holocaust museum I've ever been to. We obviously, in your definition of the people that go through it, were swimmers, because we didn't have time to do it in depth. Would have been, I think we would have needed a couple of days to do it in complete depth. And I think, thank you for what you've said today, because you've pulled together a lot of it, at least for me, and I bet for others of us that were in the group. I read the book that was recommended to us over there, Hitler, was it 1984? No, I can't remember the name of it right now, that described what went on mainly in Bulgaria, but also Macedonia. And I got the feeling that King Boris was a total wishy-washy person and couldn't be depended upon from one moment to the next. Yes.
As the wind blows.
Right. The book was beyond Hitler's grasp.
By the way, let me explain something, Barbara, because you got it right. Understand this, that we have one word now for the whole event called the Holocaust. But understand this, that in every society, and I just did this when I gave a speech on American Holocaust on the Ken Burns series. One of the most important things that Ken Burns, and let's remember, not only Ken Burns, but Sarah Botstein and Lynn Novak. One of the things that the Novak Botstein Burns group did was they presented the Holocaust as an evolving phenomenon. So 1933 is not the same as 35, it's not the same as 38, it's not the same as 42, it's not the same as 44, not the same as 45. The point I want to make, which you've touched on, is remember that everybody presumed that in 1942, Germany was going to win the war. And it looked like Germany was going to win the war. They were within 50 miles of Moscow. America had not yet gotten started. We had nobody in continental Europe. Germany was, Russia was back on its heels. We were concerned with the Pacific. That's different than what happened after the fall of Stalingrad, when Soviet troops were on the march. And consequently, when you say he was wishy-washy, he was playing to the winds, right? I'm giving you this. He was playing to the winds, but you got to ask yourself, if you're a relatively impotent leader of a country and you think Germany's going to win, you're going to behave one way. If you think Germany's going to lose, you're going to behave another way. Same thing with the Pope. Same thing with a whole range of leaders. So you've touched on a very important point. So understand this not as one phenomenon, but as an evolving phenomenon all the way through. Sorry to interrupt you, Bob.
No, that's a very good, thanks. That's a really good point, because aside, at the time that the Macedonian Jews were taken, King Boris was in charge. Bulgaria ruled Macedonia at that time. And they didn't have any Macedonian nuts. That's a joke from the trip.
Yeah.
For those people that weren't on the trip. And he wasn't really pushed to save those Jews, even though they had nothing to do, probably in his mind, with, I could be wrong, citizenship or non-citizenship, because certainly he's not alive to say whether I'm right or wrong. Whereas in Bulgaria, the final outputting, even involving Peshawar, Dmitry Peshev, he kept going even back and forth even then until he finally saved all the Bulgarian Jews.
Yeah.
It was really kind of an amazing
And
story.
let's also say something else, which I didn't say, which is that some leaders of the Bulgarian church behaved brilliantly, most especially Archbishop Stefan. And we present the dialogue with Archbishop Stefan, which is very interesting, which is the Jews were separated and segregated, and he was told by the officer, by the soldier, was not an officer at that point, who was in charge, you can't go there. And he said, well, I'm going there, and I'm not sure that you have the authority to kill me. So you better find out if you have the authority to kill me, because I'm going there no matter what. Now, again, and you got to imagine some corporals in charge who's got to decide whether to shoot, block the way, et cetera, of the Archbishop of the Bulgarian church, and the Archbishop is determined to go in that way. There was a rabbi in near Claremont, Rabbi Asa, and Rabbi Asa's father was the head of the Jewish community in a small town in Bulgaria, and the postmaster got a telegram. The telegrams went through the post office, got a telegram about the deportation of the Jews, and well before he delivered the telegram to the authorities, he delivered it to Rabbi Asa's father. And the like. That's part of the civil society's revolt against what was happening. So you think of, an archbishop, and you think of a postmaster, and delivering that type of telegram and giving a warning to the community. And that's, that makes all the difference in the world. Okay.
I would just like to ask one other thing, or say, when we were in Bulgaria, Macedonia, we were led to believe that the Jews that survived in Bulgaria were treated horrendously. Everything was taken away from them as if it was grabbed away from them. After I read this book, Beyond Hitler's Grasp, I came to the feeling that possibly it specifically said in the book that the Jews that were, for instance, put on hard labor on roads and stuff like that weren't treated as badly as the criminals, at least. That they were given more rest time. I'm just wondering what you have to know about that.
But again, let's take a look at the basic claim. The Jews were treated horrendously. They weren't killed. Wow! Wow! I mean, it's in a context. If I were to take you into the idea, why did the Jews, if you go to Poland, Poland was divided between 1939 and 41, was divided between Soviet-occupied territories and German-occupied territories. Soviet-occupied territories, they discriminated against capitalists, some of them, many of them Jews, and against Judaism. But they didn't kill Jews. Wow! Terrific, wonderful. in comparison to the situation in Germany, in German-occupied territories. So when you say the Jews had labor, but they were treated a little bit better than criminals, but they were treated horrendously and they were put into forced labor, we shouldn't celebrate that. That's not the way you behave toward your fellow citizens. It's not even the way in what you pay before the occupied. So but you got to understand, they weren't killed. The Jews who went to Siberia had hunger, starvation, disease, malnutrition, persecution, everything else, but they weren't killed. When they came back to Poland in '46 and they went through the Soviet-held territories, everybody else was destroyed. They felt all of a sudden that they were fortunate. They had been complaining all along about their situation. Then they realized they were in the Garden of Eden in comparison to the other situation.
I'm going to ask a question that came in from Zoom, just because they can't raise their hand. So Eric Maman asked, in light of the characterization of the museum for Macedonians, I'm curious how the museum has been received domestically by the Macedonian people, government, etc. Do school groups, church groups regularly experience it?
Well, it's been received very well by Macedonians. The question is, how is it received by Bulgarians? Meaning Macedonia, it tells the story of what happened to Macedonians, and it portrays the Bulgarians in an unfavorable light, though we do not go to the extreme because we show both dimensions of Bulgaria. I was in Israel last month, and there was a conference on what the archives of Bulgaria have revealed, which reveal a great deal of discrimination against the Jews all the way through, and all of the elements, and also revealed that your friend Barbara, King Boris was a son of a bitch, from top to bottom, a wavering son of a bitch, but a son of a bitch all the way through. Now, how is it received by groups? The question now is, every museum is rebuilding in the aftermath of COVID because we have been hesitant to go to places. Every institution has been rebuilding. Look, the great thing that saved this synagogue was the field. And the field is because we didn't build a school. We never imagined we needed a field. We needed a field for sports. We never imagined that a field. Look what the field has done for this synagogue, which tells you about the issue of people going to places. And there are still people now, we're 3 years away from this. They're 3 years and 3 months away from the beginning of COVID, and there are still people who haven't come back to synagogue because of their elements. So museums have to rebuild, and we'll be able to tell you in about a year and a half, how it's received by the population. Okay, other questions?
That was actually the question that I had wanted to ask, but I wanted to put this in, that our guide, who was Bulgarian, who was with us the whole time, Dimo, was interesting. At the end, after we came out of Macedonia, he approached a number of us, and later he emailed people reiterating how much he had learned and that it was really eye-opening for him. And I really get the feeling that that was one Bulgarian that really learned a broader truth, a more complex picture.
Other questions? Yes,
No.
please.
I have two questions. In Sofia, behind the St. Sophia Church, there are 3 stones honoring King Boris that supposedly were taken from Yad Vashem because King Boris was honored as one of the righteous amongst the nations. And then later, when they found out more about him, the stones were removed and now they appear behind the church. And so my question is, it sounds like the other half of the King Boris story wasn't known for a while.
Look, the Bulgarians who were saved felt that it was their duty to pay tribute to their king and their government for saving them. They didn't also pay attention to what they had done in Thrace and Macedonia. they were grateful for being saved. So the King Boris story and the whole story of the Bulgarian participation is now both undergoing research, dramatically changing the narrative, but also there are efforts in Bulgaria to portray the King of Bulgaria in a very positive light, and it's part of the Holocaust distortion that is a universal phenomenon we're seeing in country after country after country. We're going to have a consultation on Holocaust distortion, and you're going to see, every country coming forth with that type of distortion. I just was I serve on the International Board of Auschwitz. I'm one of the 2 Americans who serve on that, and we met with the Hungarian representative. And remember, Hungarian had 437,402 Jews who were shipped to Auschwitz. So almost 40% of the murders in Auschwitz were of Hungarian Jews. So they have a high interest. And he said, Hungarians are saying it's all Germany's fault. All Germany's fault. Our hands are clean, and they can't explain why they have if you've gone to Budapest, you see the shoes on the edge of the Danube where the Hungarians shot their Jews, and they did something quite, I was going to say nasty, but killing them is equally nasty. They did something quite peculiar, which is to save ammunition, they tied the Jews together and they shot every other Jew so they wouldn't waste ammunition, and they had them in the water. So every other Jew was killed, was murdered, and the third one was drowned. And therefore you have the empty shoes on the edge of the Danube. And I was in Poland, and one of the controversies we'd had in Poland are the question of what did the Poles do? And even one woman had her budget cut because she said not every Pole was sensitive to the condition of the Jews. Now, not every, by the way, that's a tongue-in-cheek remark, but when I go to, by the way, when I speak on Polish panels, I agree to be more condemnatory and radical than my Polish colleagues, because if they're going to criticize someone, let them aim at me, because I'm not going to lose my job for it. I'm not going to lose my budget for it. I'm not going to lose, my status for it. I'm not going to lose my funding for it. So I even go further than they do to protect them.
Before we went on the trip, we received an article that you had written about the history of the Jews in the Balkans. And you mentioned a series of steps, one of which were the government, you said, where the government defined the Jews. Can you tell me what that means?
The most important thing, remember the definition, Raul Hilberg, the greatest of the scholars of the Holocaust, we call him the dean of the field, essentially said that definition was the first step to destruction. Germany defined the Jews biologically based on the religion of their grandparents. That meant you were defined not by the identity you had, not by the religion you practiced, not by the traditions you embraced, but you were defined by blood. Now let's think of our good friend Whoopi Goldberg, who thinks of racism in black and white terms and didn't understand that the racism of the Holocaust was in blood terms, which is Jews who were grandchildren of Jews. Now, I studied with a man by the name of Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy. Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy in the history of Jewish thought is very important. Great Protestant theologian, but he was Franz Rosenzweig's cousin. And you have the dialogue, you have Judaism Despite Christianity, which is the great dialogue in 1913 between a man who became one of the leading philosophers of the first half of the 20th century and a man who did marvelous things for Judaism, and his cousin about the debate within it. Eugen Rosenstock Jussi was regarded as a great Protestant theologian from 1913 to 1935, and from 1940 to 1969. When was he not a great Protestant theologian? Between 35 and 40, when in Germany he was defined as a Jew. Why? That was the Nuremberg laws. So the definition of Jews, which becomes legal in that term, is very important because it becomes the first mark of destruction. You have to define the population. Why did they have the Jews wearing yellow stars? In most places in Poland, they wore white armbands because Jews look all sorts of ways, and you can't identify Jews by their external appearance, unlike, for example, black skin or the different eyes of the Asians, the color of Native Americans, etc. Therefore, they had to be marked in a very specific way. Who was marked for discrimination? That became critical issue in Bulgaria and a critical issue in Thrace and Macedonia, and it meant essentially that then led to your targeting for murder.
I have recently been to Treblinka, okay, located in a forest. It's obvious that the Germans wanted to keep all 6 extermination centers secretive. That's why they put them all in Poland, and they thought Poland did not arouse public opinion. You know, it was a safe place for all those extermination centers. Now, in the Balkans, probably the most famous German officer in the Balkans is Kurt Waldheim. He was stationed in Yugoslavia and later on in Trieste, Italy. And something I've wondered about especially when I went to Treblinka, the people that did the rounding up and in places like Skopje, the people that rounded up Jews, and Kurt Waldheim, he went to court and he said he didn't know they were being killed, and he was an intelligence officer. Okay, how much, I know that the Germans wanted to keep it secret what they were doing, but how much can you actually believe someone like Kurt Waldheim? How much were they told, the people that did the rounding up and crammed all those Jews in overcrowded cattle cars, how much were they really told? And not just in the Balkans, but in places like France and the Netherlands.
Let's begin with, we have if you live with the Holocaust all the time, you have to develop a nasty sense of humor. There is a certain branch of Alzheimer's disease, a certain type of thing of Alzheimer's disease that we called Waldheimer's disease. In Austria, Waldheimer's disease is you do not know, you cannot remember where you were between March of 1938 and May of 1945. Your intellectual recall for everything else is phenomenal, but that period of time becomes a tremendous blur. Let's talk about how we discovered that Waldheim was in Yugoslavia. In the late 1970s, 1980s, these troops who had fought these battles felt safe enough to have reunions. When they had reunions, they published and I just went to my high school reunion. They published something very interesting. They published a scrapbook of their reunions and their battles. Somebody looked at the scrapbook and discovered a picture of Lieutenant Kurt Waldheim in Yugoslavia, in the vicinity of where the killing took place. Now, Simon Wiesenthal got into trouble because he said Waldheim was there, but we can't prove he was a Nazi war criminal. And nobody's offered proof that he was a Nazi war criminal. Son of a bitch, bastard, liar, absolutely. Anti-Semite, absolutely. But war criminal, you have to have either been part of the killing or been part of what we call the desk killers who did nothing else but sign a document. We couldn't prove that of Waldheimer's. There's a book that answers your question. It's by Walter LeCoeur, written in 1982 or 81, called The Terrible Secret, The Suppression of Information Regarding Hitler's Final Solution. His claim, which he documents brilliantly in Liqueur, was a great both political scientist and historian, was that they developed ways of suppressing information. Now, some of the information being suppressed was precarious and dangerous for the victim. Some of it was why in the United States we could not do certain acts and people thought of things. Some of it also had to do with the suppression of information regarding what was happening by the Jews themselves. So let's take a very simple example. Warsaw situation. Warsaw had many departments in its Judenrat, in its Jewish council, but it didn't have an intelligence operation. The underground sent a man by the name of Zygmunt Freilich in September of 1942. Sent him, he was a former union man for trains. Sent him in 1942 to find out what was happening in Treblinka. He came back with the following, he came to a place called Malkinia, which was the train stop adjacent to Treblinka, where they held the trains so they could only send in a number of trains at the very same time that they could process. So they held the people on the train while they sent in the number that they could process. And he came to the following information. People arriving, they're arriving train after train after train. The trains go in full, they come out empty. No food has been delivered to the camp, no wells have been dug, and there's an eerie silence at night. He then says, how do I know what's happening? And they said, breathe the air. There is a peculiar smell of the burning of human flesh. He came back and told that to the underground in the Warsaw Ghetto, which is when the resistance was being formed. They understood what that represented, and that gave them a certain measure of freedom, because they understood that if you boarded the trains, you were dead. Once you have that, then you have the possibility, and if that was the fate, then when did resistance arise in Warsaw? Resistance arose on April 19th, 1943, when the trains were ready and the ghetto they were going to deport people, and everybody understood, don't board the trains, you're dead, and then you could gamble with armed resistance, because what? Because you had nothing left to lose. Freedom is nothing left to lose. There's a famous, one of the plays you should look at, there's a PBS one-man show now on Jan Karski, my colleague and friend, and I was so close to him that I spoke at his funeral, who was the man who met with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He reports a conversation the Polish courier went into the Warsaw Ghetto twice and went into Izbika, which is and the rabbi very often speaks about the Izbika Rebbe. Izbika was a way station for Belzhitz where the murder took place. At the end of his meeting with Felix Frankfurter, Oscar Cohen, and another high-ranking Jew in the Roosevelt administration, Frankfurter paces the floor. And he turns to Karski and he says, young man, I can't believe you. Polish ambassador Chekhanov stands up and says, what do you mean? I swear on the life of my children, this man is telling the truth. We trust men, material, we put lives at risk. We do all of these things on his word. I guarantee you he's telling the truth. He said, I didn't say he's lying. I said, I can't believe him. There's a difference. And that is that we have a natural instinct to suppress bad information. We all know very smart women who walked around with lumps in their breasts and didn't get to the doctor. We have smart men and women who have walked around with shooting pains and didn't get to the hospital, up and down their arms. Why? And in infidelity, they say the spouse is the last to know. Why is the spouse the last to know? Because they don't want to face the information. You don't want to face the fact that you may have, God forbid, breast cancer, that you may be having a heart attack, maybe having a stroke. You suppress the information, your spouse may be having an affair. You suppress the information because you don't want to deal with its consequences. And lots of people suppress the information. Germany used language as a tool for suppressing the information. So they said at the killing, we took executive measures. By the way, we do the same thing in America. Let's take a very simple and nasty example. We say somebody was killed by friendly fire. Tell me what's friendly about the fire that kills someone. And if you had a choice, God forbid, of someone dying in battle against an enemy than somebody dying from incompetence, malfeasance, irresponsibility, stupidity, a wasted life in the American army, there's nothing friendly about that. We clean it up. Now, I'll tell you, I'm going to go on a hobby horse for one thing. The one word I do not allow anybody to use with regard to the Holocaust is perished. Nobody perished. They were murdered. Even if you want to say they were killed, that's even a little bit too clean. They were murdered. They were killed by the circumstances which were created for them. Perished, somebody perishes, that's a different story. We use language to cleanse ourselves of the sin that's involved in the very basic thing. What did people know? Let me put it to you this way. If I moved into Rachel's home and I thought I was a guest in her home, I wouldn't move that ugly picture from her wall. If I go into Rachel's home and I'm a guest, in a million years, I wouldn't open a drawer. I can look at everything on the wall. I can look at everything on the bookshelf. But the moment I open the drawer, what would happen? I would never be invited again. If I know she's never coming back and I have the keys to her home, right? I can throw out all of the stuff. I can't fit into his clothes. His clothes would be going out in the garbage in 3 minutes or being sold. So I don't know he's not coming. I don't know he's been killed. But you damn well are behaving as if what? He's never to return. He's not coming back. These are ordinary behaviors by ordinary people who presume, but I don't want to talk about what happened to him. Right? Then I would have to know something and feel a little bit of what, guilt or responsibility. Okay, two more questions.
Well, I hope this will allow you to pursue that thought to a future conclusion. And this is not to belabor plausible deniability, but rather I'm concerned about making it, speaking too much about Germany trying to hide their activities or to ease and provide plausible deniability, but rather how all of Europe and even beyond Europe has sort of pushed the sense of responsibility for the Shoah onto us, yes, an ever shrinking group. First it was the Germans, then it was the Nazis, and it seems in recent years it's just Hitler. And I would hope that you would take an opportunity to speak to how you will speak to the coming generations, to the future Europeans, about European responsibility for a long, long history of persecution, culminating in mass murder and genocide.
Let me use language on that. We begin with language. Language is a very important tool. So for example, when do I use Nazi, when do I use German? Anything done by the state is German. So there are only German laws, there's only German occupation. There are Nazi death camps in German-occupied Poland. Nazi is that which is done by the party or its ideology, and the like, but anybody who says Nazi occupation is historically false. And part of what you have to also look at is the responsibility of the native population, because we know where the native population, what is the great achievement of Denmark? First time I went to Denmark, I heard it again and again and again. We Danes didn't do anything terribly important. We merely treated our Jews the way you treat fellow citizens when an enemy comes to deport them. Now, what is their great achievement? They treated Jews as fellow citizens. If you treat fellow citizens, you come to the aid of fellow citizens who are being persecuted by an enemy, that's normal, natural, routine, etc. What is their achievement? They treated the Jews as fellow citizens. In Poland, for example, you hear a language that we would never accept in America. You hear Poles and Jews. Imagine if somebody came out, and we may have it in our crazy world now, who spoke about Americans and Jews. We would be, what? Shaking in our boots when you speak about Americans and Jews as separate entities, because all of us feel ourselves to be what? Americans. And Americans incorporate the Jews as part of the whole thing. So we have to be careful about that. Let me touch on this as to what people knew, and let me give you one historic example, so I don't have to do it by generalizing. October 1943, Heinrich Himmler, who's the architect of the Holocaust, is meeting with the SS officers, 500 SS officers in Poznan. And he says, to have done what we have done and to remain moral and humane with a couple of exceptions, this is a great achievement of Germans, never to be told, never to be written, never to be told. Now, if you pay attention to what I said, you should ask a question. If it's never to be written, never to be told, how the hell do I know about it? And the answer is because in the back of the room, he had a tape recorder. But a tape recorder in those days was not this size. It was the size of that table. It was the size of that table. And we have a recording of his speech and the notes that he made for his speech, because on one level, he didn't want it to be written and didn't want it to be told, but he was what? Proud of it. And therefore, he what? He wanted it recorded. This was his great historical achievement and the like. And how did they deflect responsibility? They deflected, my wife is calling me, how'd they deflect responsibility? They deflected responsibility in a very basic way, all the way through, and they pretended not to know. And let me tell you, the one thing I know from study of the Holocaust is that you have to face bad news and have the courage to face it directly and not to kid yourself or anybody else about it. Thank you very much. The boss has come.
So part 2 of this will be next Sunday. Part 3 the Sunday after that. It's endless, folks, right? This is a room filled with people that have been learning versions of these stories since their childhood. And we're now, and those of us who are on this trip and now have had this opportunity to study with Dr. Berenbaum realize that, again, we're just beginning to scrape the surface of the contours, the shape, the enormity, the tragedy of the Shoah. So we're so grateful to you, grateful to share community with you, grateful for what you've done for this Jewish community in Macedonia. I'm grateful to be your students today and other days. Thank you, Dr. Berenbaum. That sort of ends the program. Those who were on the trip, feel free to stay and linger and reunionize. And thanks for being here this morning. And thanks for all the Zoomers. Great to have you. We have a meeting this week. We have a